Good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we are here today with two best-selling Australian writers. First of all, Sulari Gentill has a brand new book called Shanghai Secrets, just out from the Poison Pen Press. And Emma Viskic has a brand new book here called Darkness for Light. And what was it, last year or before the whole pandemic, right before, we had a group of four of you, right? Australian authors. That was so much fun.
Yeah, we just got in before all our borders closed. I think it was a matter of a couple of months, really. Yeah.
It was November of 2019. Patrick, I am not seeing that we're on Facebook. I'm seeing we're only on custom live streaming service. Do you need to restart this?
No, it'll take it a second for it to come up. I started it on Facebook.
Okay, well, wonderful.
Yeah. So anyway, Barbara's at her home library there, and I'm going to be, as usual, monitoring the Facebook comments field. So if you have questions for our authors, go ahead and send them in, and I will pop up whenever I'm cued. So Barbara, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. It's lovely to see you both. You know, it was so much fun. It was after the Dallas BoucherCon when you all had a grant from Australia, which I thought was really impressive for travel funds. And you came to see us. Who are we missing from that group? Two guys and another woman.
Yeah. No, Jock Sarong. Yeah, Jock Sarong and Robert Gott. Yeah.
Okay.
That was it. There wasn't any other woman.
Okay. All right. For some reason, I keep thinking Derfla McTiernan was part of that.
Oh no.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, but she was at BoucherCon. And funnily enough, because although she lives in Australia, I don't think any of us had actually managed to meet her before BoucherCon. And so Dervla actually hosted our panel at BoucherCon. So it was a meeting and a sort of reunion at the same time, because we've all chatted online, of course, but it's a very wide country, Australia, and she lives all the way over into the west, and we're all over on the east coast. So it's just we'd never managed to meet up before.
Didn't we include her in an event we did? We did a conversation. I thought I remembered negotiating all that.
We did an online Zoom. Yes.
Yeah, the four of us did it, and that's why I'm confused, thinking she was actually physically at the Poison Pen. But the other thing I remember about your visit to the Poison Pen is, in a moment of insanity, you decided to zip in a trip up to the Grand Canyon, which was like an overnight, and I mean, we were all aghast because it's so far.
Well, it was not a moment. It was more a moment of extreme generosity by a couple of Americans who were at the Poison Pen that night, who overheard us bemoaning the fact that we were in Arizona and wouldn't see the Grand Canyon, and they picked us up at 7:30 in the morning and drove us up there and back. If we tried to go ourselves, we'd still be lost somewhere in Sedona, I think.
Right, so you must have seen it from the South Rim, which is beautiful. If you ever have more time, it's a huge drive because you obviously can't leap over the canyon. You have to drive all the way around it. But the North Rim is spectacular. So I haven't given up hope that you'll both be back to see us at some point. Meantime, let me ask you, is the flooding affecting either one of you? I see that Australia is lurching from drought to flood.
I'm in New South Wales. I don't know about Victoria. We're very, very wet. But I actually live in the mountains, so if the mountains were flooded, the rest of the state would be underwater. So we're just sort of holding our heads above the saturation at the moment. But Victoria's starting to flood too, isn't it?
Yeah, but nothing like New South Wales. I mean, we're on alert, but it's okay here. But there's a famous Australian poem by Dorothy McKellar, Australia, a land of drought and flooding rains. So it's always been a land of contrast, but it's obviously much worse now with the climate crisis. And New South Wales has really had it hard, I think. I mean, Victoria had very bad bushfires as well last year, but New South Wales is copping it. Yeah.
It's an interesting thing. These bushfires are more immediately frightening, but floods do more damage because they take your topsoil, they take your fences, they take your bridges, and they just sort of use that as a battering ram as the waters progress further. So often the cleanup for a flood is much worse than the cleanup for a fire, even the big bushfires.
So, Sulari, when you're writing the Roland Sinclair series set in the 1930s, which, as you know, is one of my favorite series, and we've been doing this together forever. In fact, this is book 9, the one we're talking about today, Shanghai Secrets. Do you include a weather crisis? Was there a notable weather crisis? I remember the one book where, it was kind of like an American Western where you were out there on a station, would have been a chance for it. Otherwise, you're not always in Australia, you're in Sydney and so forth. But what would you do?
Look, I would. It's really interesting. I was speaking to some of the old timers in the RFS shed, which is our volunteer fire brigade. So in Australia, bushfires are handled completely by volunteers, and so the Batlow Bushfire Brigade, and Batlow's where I live, has an average age of about 75. So you can talk to some of the old guys in the shed, and they can tell you how they used to fight fires with wet brooms. And I find that really intriguing. I'm looking for a chance to write it, but as you know, I'm particular. I don't like to stray too far from history, so I'm waiting for the bushfires to actually come up. In the 1930s. There was big bushfires in 1932, which were mentioned in book 1, but they come up again at the end when just past America's going through a dust bowl in 1935, 1936. I think Australia hits the fires shortly thereafter, so they will come up. I mean, the thing is that disasters are similar in the sense that, whether you're in 1930 or you're in 2020, you're facing massive loss, but not just individual loss, but community loss. So there's that notion of maybe there won't be a town to rebuild because everything could be gone. And I'd really love to explore that in a novel, and have a look at that in terms of individual peril, which, Roland goes through individual peril all the time. But when you're looking at a disaster, it's that existential sense of peril where everything could be gone. And in some ways that coincides with the way he feels about the rising threat of the Nazis, that it is an existential threat to way of life across the planet, which is probably why that rings with such urgency for him. But I think, I would really like to write it now that I've lived it. But I've just got to wait for history to give me that opportunity.
You often refer to the Sinclair's family as pastoralists, which is not a term that Americans would normally use, but presumably it means that they have agricultural properties where they're raising cattle, sheep?
Ranches, ranches. So this pastoralists quite often are sheep people, as opposed to cattle, but they can be a mixed stock. And quite often in Australia, you have mixed farms, especially in this region where they do grow something. They have cattle and they have sheep, and they just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and diversify. So pastoralist sort of covers that area. So in Australia, there was a difference between a farmer and a pastoralist. To be a pastoralist, you had to be significantly wealthy and have a significant property. There weren't any poor pastoralists.
Well, I brought it up because, people are always asking, or frequently we hear that people want Brit speak translated to American, which is ridiculous. But I think that there are certainly Australian terms that are not familiar, and I wouldn't like to see them translated. So it's a good idea to explain them. So Emma, before we go off to Shanghai, Darkness for Light is what? Is this your 4th book for Caleb?
It's the 3rd Caleb book. I'm currently writing the 4th one. So it somewhere in the scheme of the series, I wasn't quite. I knew it was going to be a short series, and I wasn't quite sure where I was going to end. I mean, actually now I'm thinking it's going to be a series of short series with a jump in time. But so Darkness for Light came about when I was writing the 2nd book and fire came down. And I knew that I wanted to go into Caleb's story a little bit more with his business partner, Frankie, who I won't talk to about too much because I give away many, many plot points once I start on Frankie's backstory. but she was very much a character I wanted to spend more time with. She's she's in her late 50s. She's got a rough past. She's very gruff. And I love the way she balances out Caleb. Because Caleb needs a bit of smacking down by the women in his life occasionally. And she definitely does that. So Darkness for Light very much came about by wanting to play around with their relationship a little bit.
I know we talked about this before for the benefit of people who haven't yet heard you speak about it. Why did you decide to make your private eye, Caleb, deaf?
So the short story is I didn't. He came from what I call my murky subconscious. Really, it's only in retrospect I've understood why I made him deaf, which is it came from a very obvious place, which was I went to school with a deaf girl when I was quite young, 9, 10, when you're starting to really be interested in other people's lives and how people are different and they have different experiences. But the bigger story is that his character has always been there in some form or other ever since I was a child because of my relationship with my grandparents. And I only had grandparents on my father's side, and they didn't speak English. They were Croatian immigrants. And as was very normal at the time, I was not raised to speak Croatian. So we couldn't communicate at all. And so it was that sort of frustration with the communication and also seeing how isolated they were in their own lives. They were very happy if they were in this tight community, Slav community, but going out into the wider world was very difficult. So I can see little seeds of his character through, all my childhood writing, from a man who's blind, a girl who's mute, someone who's invisible, and it's just sort of been there the whole time. And then, of course, it takes me to write a whole book to suddenly go, oh, that's what I'm writing about. So it definitely wasn't conscious to begin with, but that's where the seeds of his character came from.
Is there a significant Croatian immigrant population in Australia? Australia, like the US, has had some pretty tense immigration moments and policies. I mean, Sulari writes about them back in the 30s when they were really ugly.
It's a small but significant portion. It's more in New South Wales than Victoria. So we had what was called a White Australia policy. That was our official government policy up until the 50s. It was very much English, Irish, Scottish immigrants. No one else was allowed in. And then there was a big discussion about whether the rude slang word, which is now owned by us, whether wogs would be allowed in, which is people from Croatia, Italy, Greece, whether they counted as white. So in the 50s, the government decided that they would be counted as white. And then the government changed, and then that's when we started getting much bigger immigration from the rest of the world, from Asia and Africa and everywhere. So it's been quite a journey culturally.
The White Australia policy was enforced in Australia till the 70s.
Oh, it was the 70s. There you go. Yeah.
70s. Yeah, we didn't actually get rid of. So my family was originally rejected for immigration on the basis of the White Australia policy back in the early 70s. But even at the time, there was a new government coming in, and that was more progressive. And the customs official told my father to go away for 5 years and try again, which is why I spent the early years of my life in Africa, because my dad took a contract in Zambia for 5 years. And that's where I learned to speak English, and then we immigrated after that. And true to his word, 5 years' time, the White Australia policy was gone, and you saw the influx of Asians originally, and lately, Australia has waves of immigrants. So initially it was Asians, and then it became people from the African continent. And that's that's the latest wave of immigrants, people from Africa. But it's quite interesting. I grew up in multicultural Australia, and you have distinct bands of immigration. So it started with what Emma terms the wogs, which was actually a term that was very owned, and then the Asians and now the Africans, and it just seems to be a stratification of our society that we're being added to with each band of immigration, which is, wonderful. It changes Australia each time.
We have a history of, it was more European. I mean, and obviously, during the dreadful times in Ireland, we had a huge Irish immigrant population. We had lots of Italians. I mean, there were whole distinct villages really in New York City from that. And Los Angeles today has very much, it has Koreatown, this and that. But of course, the whole thing is reignited here. And a big question that I thought was a good one today is the problem we're having at the moment, this surge. This is something that the Biden administration has fostered, or in fact, is this the backup from the Trump policies all the way back to 2016? I favored the latter because I think everything was bottled up, and now it's surging forward. It's hard to take the cork out of a bottle slowly, So anyway, I brought it up because I think, historical fiction is really dealing with contemporary problems. I mean, they're in a different context, but when reading Sulari's books, the things she writes about are really true today. And Emma, your books are contemporary, but nonetheless have historical roots. So there we are. I don't like it when people say I never read historical fiction or whatever, and I think, get over it. You're missing out. So
yeah, I mean, a lot of historical fiction is not talking about the past anyway. It is, as you say, talking about aspects of today, and certainly what you described in terms of your immigration spike. Australia has a different scenario, which is worse in a way. We have a very brutal policy for refugees, and the fear is that if we loosen that policy, then we're going to be suddenly bombarded with boats, and that has been used. That fear has been used to keep that quite appalling policy in place for a number of years in a way that you would not think would last in a progressive country. So that fear of surges coming in is prevalent in our society as well. It was, back in the 70s, the fear of Vietnamese immigration at the time. And in the end, the decision was made to just let them in. And the result is that nothing bad happened. We have a richer society as a result. But for some reason, we don't seem to ever learn that lesson. Every time someone wants to come in, we want to shut the door. And we don't seem to learn those lessons from history, which is why there's always fodder for historical fiction writers, I guess.
Yeah, I think that communities, it's always the last person in wants to shut the door. And particularly in, both Australia and America were really settled by immigrants. I mean, they had native populations. We won't even discuss how badly they were treated. But nonetheless, we are countries where at least the white population arrived from elsewhere. And I think that, that complicates it. But let's talk about Roland in China, because he is actually a minority in Shanghai. He's gone there. Why is he in Shanghai?
He's in Shanghai because he got into so much trouble in Book 8 that he is finding himself physically in danger from people who objected to what he did in Book 8. So without spoiling Book 8. And so his brother, his weary brother, who is trying to keep Roland alive, and out of trouble, sends him to Shanghai, ostensibly to trade wool, but with the specific instruction that he's to do anything but trade wool. He's basically there to hold the family seat at negotiations, to be a Sinclair, but not to actually do anything, because he really can't be trusted to sign anything. And so he is shuffled off to Shanghai, and of course his friends are sent with him, basically to make sure he goes. And of course, Roland being Roland, fate conspires to make his sojourn in Shanghai anything but calm and restful.
It's really too bad that Will even contemplates the fact that this quartet could stay out of trouble, because we have Roland, who has a great deal of family money, thanks in part to Will looking after it, and his bohemian group. He has a sculptor whom he loves, but it's a complicated relationship, and he has a poet and he has an artist, so it's a bohemian kind of a crowd. But
Yes.
Father in Shanghai, they meet up with some interesting characters, and Shanghai in the 30s was really a melting pot for all kinds of things, you know, different cultures, different communities there, and a lot of well, it's called spying, because they were, you know, we're coming up towards the war, and there's tremendous amount of ferment. You've got the Japanese threatening, you've got the Germans threatening, you've got the British still there, you know, you've got the Chinese government sort of, has it already been Nanking by the time Shanghai Secrets is written, the rape of Nanking? Has that already happened?
Yes,
I think
yes.
it was in 36.
So that happened in 34, 33, I think. And yes, so Manchuria has happened, and the Japanese have come into Manchuria with all the horror of that invasion. But they seem to have come to an agreement. So Shanghai is fine. Shanghai carries on like normal. And Shanghai was one of those great cities like London and New York and Paris that, you know, very little stopped it. And parties were still going on. And though tensions were rising all over the world, there was still the Japanese quarter and the German quarter and the French quarter, and Shanghai was carrying on like a treaty port. I was really interested in reading the background of Shanghai. I have a friend who was part of Australia's diplomatic service, and he used to tell me some of the stories about how Australian diplomats would play once they left the country, because, you know, what went on in such and such a city stayed in such and such a city. So it was almost like when you left the country, all the societal rules by which you abided when you were in the country were suddenly gone. And Shanghai was very much like that. It had a reputation for being an international playground where everybody lived out their wildest, most inappropriate fantasies. And so I thought that would be a really interesting, I mean, I find it an interesting place myself, but I thought it would be an interesting place to throw Roland and his bohemian entourage into a place that was probably more bohemian than they were.
Excellent point. My only trip to Shanghai was in 1990. It was the year that the Hong Kong transfer was going to happen. So what is that, 99, 97, 99? And so Shanghai was not yet fully Chinese, and the Bund, where the various foreign, you know, the commercial people still had their property, and there was nothing on that island at all. That island was just, and, you know, I can't even imagine going back, because it's transformed itself into some replica of New York City and Sydney, you know, with high rises and banks and all the rest of it. But I love the way you write about it. So Emma, since we can't talk a whole lot about what happens with Frankie without lots of spoilers, let's go back and talk about Resurrection Bay. I mean, you and Sulari have both won the Ned Kelly Award, which is Australia's fabulous crime fiction award, named for an outlaw named Ned Kelly. And Sulari didn't win it for a Roland Sinclair book. She won it for a book called Now Called, after she wrote him. And we'll ask her about another standalone she's going to do. But Resurrection Bay, when was it? 2016?
2015 in Australia, and it was probably 2016 or 17 in the US, I think. So yeah, a few years ago now. Yeah. So yeah, Resurrection Bay came about as I said, from Caleb's character, which is just percolating in my brain for a very, very long time. Just, you know, and he was one of those characters that I actually didn't want to write because I thought it would be too hard. Because I'm not deaf, I'm not hard of hearing. And so I got a long way into the manuscript and was loving writing it. I'd written a couple of full-length manuscripts before I started Resurrection Bay, and I think of them as my training wheel novels. You know, I was sort of just learning how to write a book. You know, I didn't want them published. I mean, and like I probably should burn them and burn the hard disk they're on, because if they ever came up in real life, I would be not happy. But I was writing Resurrection Bay and loving it and really getting into it and loving Caleb's character. But I had this moment of absolute sheer terror, both because there are dangers of writing outside your lived experiences, and you should be cautious because you can hurt people and you can misrepresent people, and you can also take space and attention away from people in that in that community who may not have a voice or as much of a voice. But also there was the technical side of how do you write a deaf character. I love dialogue. In fact, my early drafts are almost like film scripts. It's all about dialogue. It's how I get to know the characters. If I don't know what's happening next, instead of the old, you know, have a man walk into the room with a gun, I'll actually just get my characters talking, and one of them will say something shocking eventually, and I go, oh, thank you. And that's the direction I go in. So I put the manuscript away for ages, but both Caleb's character and the opening scene I just could not let go of. So Resurrection Bay opens, and there's no spoiler in this at all because it's the first sentence. It opens with Caleb holding his best mate's body in his arms. His mate has been killed. There's blood everywhere. He's sitting in a suburban kitchen. And I really wanted to know what happened next. I wanted to know, had Caleb killed him? You know, he seemed like a decent bloke, but maybe he'd killed him. Had his best mate been up to something? Was he a good bloke? Was he into dodgy things? So I after 6 months, I thought, well, I can't bear not knowing what happens next. So let's just keep writing and see. And that's, of course, when I started, you know, a huge amount of research and went off to learn Australian Sign Language and went down a huge rabbit hole of research and, you know, lived experiences. So yeah, really Resurrection Bay came about because I can't bear not knowing things. If I want to know the answer to something, I just cannot bear not finding out, or at least exhausting all opportunities. And unfortunately, no one else was going to write the book for me, so I had to do it.
So the point of view character, who is your point of view character? Because it's difficult to have dialogue if the character is deaf. I mean, I assume that's why you learned sign language. What is it called? Auslan, Australian Sign Language?
Yeah, Auslan, yeah. That was one of the... Sometimes the hardest thing in writing actually ends up being an absolute gift to the book or to you as a writer. And that's definitely true of writing a deaf character. So all the things that I thought were going to be really hard actually made the book better. So dialogue was, for example, I was worried that I couldn't have much dialogue in it, but in the end, Caleb has to be able to be independent. He can't have an interpreter with him. That means he has to be able to lip read. Lip reading is actually really hard. I've learnt to lip read. I'm extraordinarily bad at it. Most people, everyone lip reads to a certain degree. If you're in a noisy room and you know, you're looking at someone and trying to work out what they're saying, and suddenly the lights get dim and you can't understand people. So that's lip reading. You're doing it all the time. But obviously, once you lose your volume, you lose a lot more of the words. So I realised that Caleb was going to miss important information in the books. So once I realised that that was actually a gift as a crime writer, I could really lean into it. Caleb doesn't know if he's missing important information sometimes. So the reader doesn't know if he's missing important information. He can also have someone sneaking up behind him. He can have somebody tell him something that he misinterprets or suspects that he misinterprets. So you've got all those layers of things that although they're difficult as a writer, are actually a gift to the book. The sign language was a little bit of a different side. I wasn't quite sure if he was going to use sign language at all. Most deaf people don't use sign language. There is a very strong deaf community, but that's a very it's a discrete community, and that culturally you are deaf, you use sign language, and there is a great pride and connectivity. But the majority of people who are deaf aren't born into a deaf family, so they have to find their way there, which actually Darkness for Light, I really explore Caleb and the deaf community and coming into that. So sign language became a way of showing Caleb at ease in his life. And it also showed a way of people being close to him. So the people in his life who love him at least attempt to sign. So we have his ex-wife who's fluent, and we also have his business partner, Frankie, who is a terrible, terrible signer. But she tries, and her signing is also often unintentionally quite crude. And quite a few of her experiences are actually my experiences of accidentally signing things I don't intend as a new student, because, you know, people sometimes tease you when you're learning a new language and teach you words and signs that perhaps don't mean what they say they mean, and you unintentionally may sign things that aren't good for polite society. So I learned quite a lot of those things, and very conveniently was able to put them into Frankie's hands along the way. So it was a great journey of exploring all these things, and it's a continual journey as I continue to learn.
So in terms of Caleb listening to, well, being signed so he can take in information, many people who are deaf have trouble speaking intelligibly. Is that a problem for Caleb?
Well, I decided quite early on that, first of all, he would have to be a skilled lip reader, and he would have to be a skilled speaker. It makes sense for his personality too. He's extremely determined, stubborn to the extent that it is bad for him and the people around him. So it very much makes sense, and from his family history, his relationship with his father, that he would be absolutely determined to, as his ex-wife accuses him, pass. He wants to pass as normal. And this is not a healthy thing for him, but he's put a great deal of time and effort into being able to live in the hearing world. He's also post-lingually deaf, which means he learned to speak as a hearing child, became deaf as a young child through meningitis. So that's a really common experience. And funnily enough, since writing the books, I've met many people, and also found out many people I already knew are actually deaf to a very because it's a spectrum. People I had no idea. Deaf, wear hearing aids, and I hadn't actually realised that they were until they told me. So it's a really interesting spectrum of experiences.
I can imagine there's tremendous, progress in miniaturizing hearing aids and so forth here in the United States. In fact, it can be a predatory kind of an industry, but and the wisdom that I have heard, although I'm currently ignoring it, is that when you get to be 80, you really ought to take on hearing aids, because your brain will not adjust as you get older. And if you wait too long, you never really will adapt to hearing aids. So my husband, who's younger than I am, has hearing aids and won't wear them. My son-in-law has hearing aids and rarely wears them. I don't have any, but I'm old enough that maybe I should. So it's a difficult thing apparently for people to accept and acknowledge. But as you say, you can also bluff your way through it if you are able to adapt to the increasing miniaturization, recharging. You don't have to change batteries. That defeated my mother, who really needed hearing aids in the last years of her life. She was 94 when she died, and she wasn't able to deal with changing batteries and so forth. It was too hard for her because her sight wasn't good, her hands didn't work like they should, and all that. So she ended up being so isolated because she couldn't communicate. And it seems to me that is the primary difficulty that deaf people have is that lack of two-way communication, or sometimes any communication.
That's exactly, and that was one of the joys of Darkness for Light is I have Resurrection Bay where there's trauma, and Fire Came Down, which is about the aftermath of trauma. And Darkness for Light is Caleb finding his way into a better space. He starts off, he's trying, he's using therapy, he's reconnecting with the deaf community. And the deaf community is easy for him because you get the two-way communication. Everyone signs and there's no effort involved. But of course, then you have to explore the darker side of that where everyone knows all your secrets.
So in Shanghai Sulari, assuming that we don't have native Chinese speakers in Roland's party, there's a communication issue going on there, and that they're going to need interpreters, not just for the Chinese, but the Russian and whatever else comes along.
Yes. So Shanghai was such a multilingual place because it had all the quarters. People speaking French and Russian and German, and Shanghainese, which is different again. And of course, the different parties communicated through Pidgin. And Pidgin is a really awkward thing to write because it sounds like those terrible depictions of Chinese people in old movies, which made them sound infantile. But Pidgin, when you do a little bit more research, was not about badly spoken English. It was because at the time, many Chinese didn't think English worthy of learning. And so they just used Pidgin as a method of communicating when they had to with the English barbarians, and then they maintained their own society. So what funnily has been used in old movies and Western media to make it seem as though Chinese people were lesser was actually an indication of how they felt they were better. And so it's really intriguing. But it's a horrible thing to write because it does sound disrespectful when you write it. But the fact is, it was, and people who were touring in Shanghai were given little books on how to translate things into Pidgin so that they could communicate with people. Things like chop chop, which you really, when I didn't really think it was a real thing, I thought it was something that came out of cartoons, but in fact it was. So so that was interesting. Roland speaks a lot of languages, but he doesn't speak any Asian languages. And part of my reasoning for going to Shanghai, or why part of the reason I wanted Roland in Shanghai, is I realized that I had written 8 books, and the 8 books are really discussions of how we got to the place that we did in World War II. And I realized that I had addressed that by looking west the whole time. And there was another half of the world where things were going on. And I hadn't actually considered that. And I hadn't looked at what was going on in the East. I hadn't looked at, tensions rising with the militarization of Japan and their expansion. I hadn't looked at what the Germans were doing in the East as well as Americans and all the other countries. And I hadn't actually looked at how trade was being used as a weapon, which it still is today. So I thought that Shanghai would be a great way of forcing Roland's eyes to the East and having him look at it from a different perspective, and maybe address why he feels the way he does about things. Now, I mentioned before that he has this sense of urgency about what's going on in Europe and what the Germans, what the Nazis are doing to basically disenfranchise socialists and Jews and anybody who disagrees with them. But the question that was always ticking over for me is, why does he care about that so much when in his own country, the Aboriginal people are completely disenfranchised? And certainly, you know, when you look at America, it had its own problems with people being not so much legally disenfranchised, but socially disenfranchised. And one of the things that intrigues me about when I write is the overriding question of what makes you stand for one thing and not another. Or do you just stand for one thing? What makes one thing your fight? And I don't know that I ever answer it in this book. I don't know that there is an answer, but I wanted to put the question to Roland. And certainly in this book, Wing Zhao, who is a Chinese man who speaks languages and acts as an interpreter for Roland, but who has experienced the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, puts that question to Roland. And I just wanted to see what he thought. I'm not sure that he actually answered coherently, but I just wanted him to think about it.
Well, it's an exciting story and actually has humor in it for anybody who thinks this is a really dark and intense book. I mean, all of the Roland Sinclair's About Bad Things Happen have a lot of humor. Some of it's situational, some of it just the way the characters interact. But I was thinking for both of you, you know, one of the things that we haven't quite mentioned, and it came up for me when we had a famous Swedish author come to the Poison Pen to do a program. And he obviously had learned enough English, you know, some English, and he had an interpreter with him. And we did the program, but I could see that it was quite a strain for him. And afterward, as you both know, is our usual policy, you know, to socialize, you know, have an after party and all. And, you know, and I thought about that. I offered them a ride back to their very posh hotel here in Scottsdale. And I really thought about, you know, should I keep up our tradition and, you know, offer them drinks and offer them food and all. And then I thought to myself, they're exhausted. They are exhausted trying to talk to me in English. I don't have any Swedish, so that was never going to go. And the kind thing to do would be to leave them, you know, to retreat to their own language and relax. And, you know, I think that that would be true of Roland and his friends in Shanghai when they just want to hang out together. It would be true of Caleb, you know, in his world. And I don't know that we really appreciate how exhausting it is to be navigating a world in which we cannot fully communicate.
Yeah, it's something I think aware of empathically, you know, how you get into a character's brain, but it wasn't actually until I physically put, you know, foam earbuds in my ears and went out into the world and tried to go about my shopping and catch buses and talk to people and order coffees and get the wrong order in cafes while trying to lip read, that I realized how deeply exhausting it is to always be doing that. And I've lived in other countries where I haven't spoken the language and have had to learn the language. And so I knew how tiring it was, but I also knew it was for, you know, it's only for a year or it's only for 2 years. This is your entire life that you're doing it. And I think you're right, that deep sense of exhaustion, and also why people like Caleb will just then stand back. I don't need to be part of this world because I'm not quite part of it. So this is where, you know, the lone gumshoe, the lone detective, you know, really comes into his own or her own, is if you can get that sense of, it's just too much, back off.
Well, I think it's easy to be deceived in situations like that where you certainly don't get all the nuance. You don't necessarily grasp everything that's been said, and your impulse is almost in some ways to turn inward. So, you know, I think it works very well in Shanghai Secrets, Sulari, for you to do that.
Well, yeah, look, I think also sometimes, though, not being able to understand the spoken word allows you to understand other things. So I have memories of being thrown into school with no English, which is the way it was done in those days. You had children and you wanted them to learn a language, you just sent them to school. And I remember being in a school where nobody understood me except my sister. But I also remember watching people. And I think probably, I mean, it may be that my habit of watching people came out of those few weeks when nobody understood a word I said, because your only way of understanding what people were wanting to do, whether they were hostile, whether they were friendly, is to pay very close attention to their body language. And I think, you know, that's always what I was trying to do with Roland, because he's an artist, he's an observer first. So he watches people just naturally, because he's all, of course, thinking about it in an artistic sense and composition, how he'd paint them. But it allows him to get nuance that he would miss if he was just listening to what they said. Because quite often deceptive, you know, if someone's being deceptive, it's they're primarily deceptive through their words, and they're not so much in control of their face and their body language and their actions. But I do understand what Emma's saying in terms of the exhaustion of having to communicate. It is a really I mean, even on a minor level, when you go to a party where you don't know anyone, it's exhausting at the end of it, because you're trying to be a part of conversations and trying to make links. So that's in a very minor scale that maybe everybody can understand. Then language is a different level, where you don't have a clue what anybody's saying, but then everybody knows that you don't understand the language, so they're trying to help you. Deafness is another level again, where it can sometimes be hidden, and people don't actually understand enough to assist you, and in fact, you know, do things like mumble or talk from behind a newspaper inadvertently, because they don't understand that they're excluding you by doing that.
I like your thing about the observation is absolutely true, though, because that was one of those gifts that was given to me by writing Caleb's character, because I'm not at all visual, I'm oral. And because he had to be picking up on those body language clues. So it's a real gift for him, but it's actually made me a much more observant writer, a slightly more observant person. Like, I do occasionally remember where I've been and where I'm going and maybe what someone looks like. You know, it's still a bit of a challenge, but it's made him a lot more observant, definitely.
Well, there's a lot more science that's been developed about how to read people's facial and other signals and determine whether they're lying or, you know, being deceitful, or what kind of emotional state they're in and so forth. So yeah, and I think, Sulari, you're right that, you know, writers are observational by nature. You know, you're making stuff up, but at the same time, it has to spring from somewhere, some well. And so you have to create that. Patrick, you're hiding back there in your black screen, but maybe you should come out and see if you have questions or comments that you would like to put forth.
Yeah, let's see. Not too many questions, but Victoria has a question for you, Emma, which is, do you have any plans to take Caleb out of Australia for a future novel?
Oh, that is such an interesting question. Maybe is the answer to that. I'm always exploring different ideas of situations I can put him into, and what is interesting. And I definitely wanted this series to be not just in Australia, but in this very specific area of Australia, in the south, in the the southeastern corner. Because every area is quite different. It's like the United States in that all the states are quite different. They have different topography and different people. So taking him to a different country is something that I have thought could be really, really interesting. But I would have to come up with a really good reason why. And then we have another layer of him not being able to understand as well, because once you get accents into it, it's even harder. And sign language is not universal, so he would not have sign language to fall back on, which could be a gift for the book. So the long answer to that is that. The short answer is maybe.
That is so interesting. I hadn't thought about sign language not being universal, but of course it
Yeah.
isn't.
No.
Language would change. So yeah, you would be back to ground zero if you landed in Russia or somewhere, and there you were.
I'm sure there are regional, regional slang
Yes.
in sign language.
Yeah, you have to be quite careful. Even Australia, which is relatively universal sign language, there are like, so the sign for thirsty in the southern states where I am is actually the sign for horny in the northern states. And you only find that out when you've signed the wrong thing. So yeah, you could be, there's definitely slang involved.
Yes, I can see if you said I am, it could go very badly depending on how that went. Speaking of other countries, Sulari, this is the 9th Roland Sinclair, and we are in Shanghai, but it's a springboard to the 10th Roland Sinclair, which takes the whole group to Boston in a book called Where There's a Will. Or at least I think it's still called Where There's a Will.
Yes, it is. It is called Where There's a Will. I haven't actually seen it printed yet, so I suppose it could still change, but it is called Where There's a Will as far as I know.
So it's really intriguing, Australia to Shanghai to Boston. And one of the reasons the Roland Sinclairs work so well is that air travel is a part of them. They've been able, because Australia is a long way to other places. And so far, our heroes have been to Germany, England. They've been on a transatlantic liner to the United States. Now they're in Shanghai. Then they're going to go to Boston. And then the end of book 10, even I don't know what's going to happen next. Do you, Sulari?
I think Roland's going to go home for a while to Australia because there's things going on there, and he does need to come home occasionally because he has a dog. And I'm a dog owner, and when he's overseas, I worry about Lennon and how Lennon is doing with Roland away. So I do make him go home every now and then and spend some time with his dog. Yeah, so I think he will reset in Australia, but he's also actually keen to come back to America. So what has happened for him in Australia is that he can't really exhibit in Australia anymore because he's been branded as a communist sympathizer and an insurgent, but America doesn't know him. So America is a whole new place for him to go, and where he can actually be an artist and exhibit, which is what he is fundamentally. So we'll see what goes on. I'm in 1936, so there's a lot happening. I don't plot. I just throw Roland on the page and see what happens. But I am aware that in 1936 we're seeing the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, the Berlin Olympics. So there's a lot of things happening around the world which may pull him in one direction or another.
It was an incredibly tumultuous decade, no question. I mean, just one major thing after another. Patrick, anything else?
Well, I just have a quick question for both of you regarding, who are some of your influences as writers? Were there, Australian crime novelists that you really looked to for inspiration? And as a corollary to that, we all know about, Arthur Upfield. He's one of the famous Australian crime novelists. How is he viewed there now? Have his books aged well?
No.
Arthur Upfield is really considered a little bit of a relic, don't you think, Emma?
Yeah.
He's he's part of our literary history, but we're very aware that a lot of his opinions and his views and the way that he wrote is certainly not something that Australian society would accept today. But he's very popular in France and Germany, I hear.
It was interesting. I actually hadn't heard his name for possibly decades until we went to the United States. I think most readers here probably aren't even aware of him unless they're older readers here. I don't even know if his books are still in print in Australia, I'd say.
Look, there was a movie about
Yes.
Perfect Murder that featured Arthur Upfield, which is why I became aware of him. And of course, I knew about the Boney series.
Yes, yeah.
Um, which
it is interesting how things have changed over the years of what is acceptable in writing and what is right at the time of an era. In terms of influences, I mean, there's a huge body of great Australian crime writing, and sometimes it's hard to spot your own influences. But I mean, I think I've probably been influenced by every single book I've read, be it crime or literary or whatever you want to call it. And as much as I can spot influences, I think if I went back to my teenage years when I was reading John le Carré and people like that, obviously made a huge impact. But equally, like Jane Austen or Stephen King or someone. In terms of Australian crime writers, you've got Peter Corris going back to that first real urban Sydney style of writing, and Peter Temple, and then contemporary, you've got great writers like Mala Nunn, and oh god, I'm going to think of forget a whole slew of names now, but even just looking at the long lists and the short lists of the David Awards, which is our Sisters in Crime Awards, and the Ned Kelly Awards, you see this great slew of Australian crime writers that are coming through now, but also back the last 20, 30 years. Dorothy Porter is a huge one that no one's ever heard of outside of Australia. She's a brilliant writer. She wrote a couple of crime novels in verse. The most famous one would be The Monkey's Mask, which is it's like a standard gumshoe investigator, but she's a lesbian investigator, and it's this very short novel in verse of an investigation. Brilliant stuff.
What's it called again?
The Monkey's Mask by Dorothy Porter. And very
about the phone here.
It's interesting in terms of influences. There's the influences you had until you wrote your first book. And then once you write your first book, you become part of the writing community, and it's an ongoing cycle of influences. So I was very steeped in Agatha Christie, to tell you the truth. I wasn't really into the Australian crime writing scene when I wrote my first book. And I wasn't really actually into a vast crime novel reader. I read widely, but I wouldn't have said that crime was my genre of choice until I wrote a crime novel. And then I discovered this richness of Australian crime. Since then, people who have sort of gone the path, like Morel Day, for example, with the Harry Lavender series, which really set new standards in Australia at the time. And then, of course, the names that Emma's already mentioned, Marla Nunn, Pam Newton, there's Angela Savage.
There's Terry Greenwood and Jane Harper and Candace Fox in her earlier books.
Of course.
And then interestingly, you've got Michael Robotham, who lives in Australia now, but his books are still set in England. And Barry Maitland might have moved into Australia as the standing, but wrote a wonderful London policing series. So, it's a complicated, but that's true of American crime fiction too.
Yeah. So I think, I see what Emma means in that it's hard to pinpoint your influences because you're constantly being influenced. And every person you read and every person you meet influences you. And sometimes you haven't even read their novel, but they influence you in their attitudes and their discussions and their conversations, the way that they value the craft, and their insight into the craft. So one of the great benefits of being a published crime writer is that you suddenly have access to this wonderful school of just being around other crime writers and learning from them without actually even trying.
Good point. Patrick, anything else?
That's about it, really.
Oh, anything you guys would like to ask each other? Emma, do you have a penetrating question for Sulari and vice versa?
Yeah, so Sulari, is your next one a standalone or is it another rolling?
The next one that's coming out is a standalone. It's actually called The Woman in the Library now. It was in fact a book that I wrote for Barbara when she was my primary editor. So that'll come out in May. And then hopefully it'll be Rolly 11, which will be the next one out then. So America's basically catching up. Where There's a Will be out in January in America, and then things will move on.
Is that a contemporary, The Woman in the Library?
Yes, it is. It is. And you know, when I wrote After She Wrote Him, I never thought I'd ever write another contemporary book. But I had such a lovely experience working with Barbara on Crossing the Lines as it was then, that it gave me the courage to write a contemporary book. I used to say to people, I'm not a contemporary person. I can't write a contemporary book. I don't know how people nowadays think. and you know, I think people forget that even after you've had a number of books published, this is a really insecure profession. And I know for myself, I'm always trying to justify my existence in it. And I'm always very tentative when I step outside my field. So I've established in historical fiction, and After She Wrote Him was just an idea that I had that had to be written, and so it was written. But I never really expected anyone to pick it up, and I never really expected for it to really speak to people the way it has, and I never really expected it to be such a joy to work with an editor on it. And so that's why I stepped into contemporary fiction for a second time, which is why the second book is Barbara's in my mind, because it's a similar sort of step into contemporary, but also looking at writing and the minds of writers, which has now become a secondary interest outside the, what led to World War II for me.
It was a real joy to work with you on After She Wrote Him and to see how it evolved. And it's a very complicated story. And it's also, it's almost always true with really complicated stories. The hard part is to bring it all together in the end game. It's easy to start it. It's easy to throw those things out there and follow them, but to bring it together in a successful resolution is a real challenge. And Sulari is a joy to work with, because whatever suggestion you make to her, whether she agrees with it or not, she considers it. So it's a very collaborative process. And we did the same thing with, is it The Woman in the Library? Not the girl. Okay.
The Woman in the Library.
We went back and forth a lot on it. And there's epistolary material in it, which is another interesting way to tell a story. So it was great. I hope we can keep this up, Kim. I really enjoy working with your contemporaries and the Rowlands, so we'll carry on. Emma, you've already mentioned that you had another book coming. Sulari, what would you ask Emma?
I would ask you about this other book. We did speak when we were wandering around America about what other than Caleb you may be thinking about. What other than Caleb are you thinking about, Emma?
So I'm just about to dive into the edits of Caleb 4. And at the same time, it's quite a weird headspace to be in, actually, because I haven't been in this headspace before, because I've been writing a series. As I'm writing the current book and as I'm editing, I am thinking about the next book in the series, but it is the same world. It is the same characters with outside characters coming in, but it's a universe I know extremely well. At the moment, I'm deeply thinking about Caleb 4 because I'm diving into the edits, and I'm thinking about this next book. And so I've got two worlds in my brain at the moment, or three, I guess, because it's the world I'm actually living in, but I don't pay much attention to that, so that's fine. So I've got Caleb 4 and I've got a standalone, and there's about 3 standalone novels that I want to write next. But the one I'm almost certain I'm going to write is, I'm doing an anti-Sulari, is actually a historical novel. Which is a little bit inspired by some family history, but it's going to be a Between the Wars novel, and it's very much calling to me. And it just, as you say, the contemporary novels draw on the past so much and the historical novels are looking towards the future. So yeah, I think this is so. Yeah, I've got a couple of characters there who are just like knocking on the door, saying, "Start writing." So we'll
wars 20s and 30s, or 20s or 30s.
30s. Yeah.
Wow. It's a really hot era to write about, and here we are living through it again. So I think it probably inspires us to think about it. You know, one of the great joys of Zoom, assuming there are any, but there really are, is the opportunity to talk to you, because the odds that we could have done this together in Scottsdale were not terrific. And Patrick and I have both commented about how wonderful it is that we can assemble people from different locations and still have wonderful conversations. So it's really been a pleasure, ladies. Thank you so much for getting up early, brewing your coffee. It's actually the next day in Australia. It's Thursday morning there, and it's Wednesday afternoon here. Sulari found out the hard way because she tried to sign in yesterday, forgetting the time difference. But anyway,
I was wondering where everybody was. I thought, oh my goodness, I was practically sending tweets to Emma and Barbara saying, "Where are you?"
And where we were was the wrong day, right? But it all worked out. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your day, ladies. It's been lovely to talk to you. Patrick, thank you as ever for your terrific hosting. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.